Chapter 329, Aspirations on Another Side of the Territory. Finally they're hiring again, another person exclaimed, looking up at the sky with a bright smile. Crow and the others were currently gathering resources because they didn't want to risk going outside at this time, as they had heard of the dangers. The three of them happened to have landed level 4 during the beast tide. It was an amazing feeling. Too bad the monsters got so much stronger, and none of them were able to revel in his newfound strength, because it was nothing in front of their new enemies. "Happy brother," an innocent voice asked beside them, and the trio looked at their new group member and doormate, Kuyu. He was a few years older than they were, but his mind stayed at a child's age. No matter, this new brother of theirs was adorable no matter what. Especially Crow, who pretty much owed his life to him, or rather, his late brother. During the mob, he was surrounded by monsters, so many that the sentries weren't able to deal with some of them. At the time, both Dog and Sunny were taken somewhere else as they fought. He remembered the brave George joining him in the fight, and the two of them fought back to back. Crow was touched. They seemed to only share a dormitory at most. They barely even talked before. The two lads defended bravely, and they rode on the momentum to kill one with the help of the sentries. Unfortunately, an accident happened. While they were distracted by a monster, a smaller one appeared next to them. It happened that George was nearer, basically covering him by virtue of his position. The man was pulled by a monster to be mauled. The only thing Crow could have done for him was try to recover his corpse as intact as it could be. George definitely saved his life. Sadly, it was at the expense of his. As he picked resources, his fist tightly clenched what he was holding in the memory. "Brother Crow, don't hurt yourself." His dark eyes softened, and he let out a rare non-creepy smile. He ought to make it up to this brother, who lost his only relative because of him. "Of course we are happy," Crow said, answering his first question, "because we'll have a chance to become stronger." Like Rowan, Ku asked, particularly fascinated by fire. It was not a surprise for his simple mind to like the showy element. Fortunately, his affinity was fire, otherwise, his young mind would have been very disappointed. Crow's lips twitched. His element was wind. Maybe. "Can you make fire go pew-pew?" he asked, voice habitually nasal. Before he could answer, though, a boisterous laugh behind him sounded. "Or a little Ku, he'll have to train a lot harder to be that cool," Hubert said in amusement, his blonde hair filled with leaves. He then suavely, or at least he thought so, shook his head, the leaves gracefully falling down his head and shoulders. Hubert was another life and death friend they made during yesterday's battle. He had pulled Dog to the side because he accidentally went to the path of a sentry arrow, already released. If Hubert wasn't there, Dog would have been skewered to death. Anyway, Ku looked at the blonde in puzzlement. "Really?" "Yes, but your brother will be joking with the guards soon. When he's become friends with the actual cool guys, maybe he can ask them to make fire for you." "Really, that's awesome." Crow rolled his eyes. Hubert was actually in the exact situation as he was. He had no doubt that this guy would throw a legitimate party if he was accepted for the job. "Well, I'd definitely join in," Dog said with a shrug. "Yeah, but are our contribution points enough to try?" "It should be. We killed a lot during the beast tide," Sunny said, giggling. "Let's check the village center for our status later." Hubert nodded, adding some resources to his basket for selling. Since they were going to the center anyway, might as well maximize the trip. As he did so, he couldn't help but wonder who got the most contribution points among them. "I wonder who won the rewards," he asked, making a mental note to check the rankings to feed his curiosity. The question, though, made everyone pause, thinking. In the end, a few faces appeared in all their heads. The people who actually got the most kills were actually just Althea, Oslo, and Rowan. In order to encourage the people, though, she rewarded the top 2 non-Aborigine that came after them, who were Drake and Hugo. Both of them were already permanent residents, and they decided to sell their winnings for some gold instead. The list was not announced, simply because the winner received a question whether to remain anonymous or to announce in the territory, which all of them refused. It was around here that an old man gathering stones nearby scooted over, eyes filled with gossipy light. Not counting the Aborigines, then Ms. Althea must have won. "Oh, yes, I heard she pretty much killed most of the level 4 and level 5 monsters attacking the east gate." "Wow, how, her level is high but not that high, right?" "She got good equipment." Oh yes, I heard she got a good weapon from the system gift pack. Well, she did invent a lot of things. Hubert sighed dreamily. Beautiful and capable. Goddess is a goddess, he said, hands on his chest as if keeping his heart there. Poetically, if he didn't, he thought it'd fly to Althea every time he thought of her. He was one of the people with Ansel at the time they were rescued by Althea. The image could be said to have been imprinted, like on many others. The old man nodded, smiling proudly at the information he got from a teammate, who happened to be datting a guard. You may not know, but I heard Ms. Althea threw bombs. Gasp. What? Seriously? No citizen was assigned in the East Gate, and after the tide they went to rest. This was immediately followed by a busy preparation for the lifting of the protection, so a lot of things hadn't spread widely yet. Do you think she'll sell it? Where? The supermarket? The other two rolled their eyes. Maybe she'd build a new shop. I heard she also had paralysis and poison bombs. Explosive bombs may not be sold, but those two could be. Someone asked her. Too shy. Then a lot of men couldn't help but remember her beauty, and were hyped to have an excuse to talk to her. I volunteer. He was nudged by an arm. No, I will represent our group. It won't do to spam her, Hubert said with a confident smirk. Why does it have to be you then? Hubert grinned, combing back his lustrous blonde hair not too inferior to Oslo's. Because I'm the most handsome. He was then beaten up by his team. Fortunately, the territory only banned legitimate fighting in the territory, outside the fighting arenas, which was characterized by a motive to hurt and reduced health. Otherwise, the whole gang would have received a yellow card then and there. On the other hand, there were people who had been preparing to go out when the ban was announced. They froze when they read the contents, as they were really ready to meet the monsters head-on. They really made a lot of money from the last beast tide. They came a few days before the beast tide, and were inspired by the locals to do more work. Under the protection of sentries and aborigines, they really did earn a lot, strength and monetary-wise. Wait, there's an instruction that people below level 5 must come with the guard team. I heard the level of monsters outside would spike up after the protection period. It was a dark-skinned man with very curly hair, trying to convince his white friend not to be rash. The man who was looking forward to hunting outside looked around sarcastically. Monsters, really, where? SHHH, don't ask for it, are you an idiot? The man rolled his eyes, and was about to mock his companion for being a coward when the ground vibrated. Somewhere above the wall, a guard shouted. Attack, he bellowed, it's a monster attack. The dark-skinned man glared at the other man. You damned crow mouths. Later. Can he say sorry? At this time, Althea was lounging in her living room, bonding with the children. You grow up so quickly, Althea mumbled as she rolled her Barbies on the cot. Clearly only a month old, but they were already on the verge of crawling. Well, if dragging one's little butt to move counted as crawling. HNGHBGMM, little Pepper mumbled, her clear blue eyes looking at her, while little Meatball drooled all over. Gammon, Meatball drooled so much some started to flow to where Pepper was. Little Pepper felt the wetness and her face scrunched, rolled over, dragging her body, almost crawling, stomach down. Althea giggled. She leaned down to place kisses on the two Barbies, and pondered whether to guide them on their crawling journey, or let nature take its turn. Before she did so, however, a blaring alarm sounded around the whole territory, followed by vibration of the walls getting hit. Althea frowned, her spine straightened in tension, whipping her head to face a direction. They're here. I'm counting on you, she told Lola, who took her Barbies into her arms. Yana was already preparing the place they would place the kids. It was located in the living room, but with a clean new cot added. It was filled with toys they bought a day prior, just for babysitting duties. At this time, Mathilda had already gone out to her team, handling their scope, leaving the two old women there wanting to contribute somehow. Fortunately, Althea knocked on their door, asking them for help, allowing them to do a bit more for the territory. Or, to be more accurate, one of the people carrying it on her back. No problem, Lola said, but she couldn't help but look at Althea worriedly. She heard from Mathilda before she left that the monsters outside were far stronger than what they had encountered so far. No one was certain how they would truly fare against these monsters. Be careful out there, Lola said, and Yana, who just returned from setting up the play place, nodded in agreement. She also took one baby in her arm, and Lola did the same. "Please try not to get hurt." "Of course," Althea said with a smile. "Thank you for always being available to care for the kids. I can only fight with little worry for them because of this." "We love the children, don't worry." Lola shook her head, feeling that they didn't deserve so much praise. She then looked at the Barbies and let them face their mother. "We are all waiting for you to get back safe and sound, aren't we, little kids?" she said, and the two old women held the Barbies' hands to help them wave at their mum. The Barbies had long been teary, as if sensing that their mother was risking her life. Marmang. Doogmang mum. Althea smiled and wiped the Barbies' tears. They were so well behaved to not be making a scene despite wanting to. "Mommy will come back very soon, Tilda," she said, kissing them many times before reluctantly walking away, this time without turning back. The two old women listened as the little Barbies whimpered, but were otherwise well behaved. It was amazing, and it also broke their hearts. The old women sighed as they watched Althea's back, so lithe and brave, go farther and farther until she was no longer in sight. "Such a wonderful woman," Lola said, heaving a deep breath and lulling the baby in her arms to relax and not be too sad. Yana also lifted a baby up and gestured to take him to the play place, hopping to distract them a bit. It was just that as the twins lay there, seeming to have none of their characteristic energies, the two old women could only look at each other and sigh in depression. Poor things. She shouldn't be forced to risk her life like this, especially when she has such small little ones waiting for her to come home. Alas, Yana sighed, such is the world now, we can only adjust. Althea watched as the newly arrived monsters attacked her territory from the walls, her emerald eyes looking at them deeply, studying them. Thanks to the sentries, there were only about a dozen monsters left at this time, but they were large, about 2 meters high. They had large upper bodies, 3 massive fangs, and bluish scale-like skins. At this time, a lot of guards were in this part of the battlement, and they had continuously tried shooting at the monsters, but they didn't so much. Fortunately, the sentries were reliable, and the main walls had barely taken damage, keeping the monsters at bay and killing a few. Studying the setup more, Althea realized that they destroyed the outer fence, seemingly like stepping on a cake. Jerks. Annoyed, she used her ability to determine their levels. She flinched a bit when she saw them to be 8s and a level 9. She frowned, this was far from what they were used to. Althea immediately aimed her arrow at the bastard, who did the most damage. Although her Bellagio bow could be used against much stronger monsters, that was in the hands of much stronger archers. As she was currently, she could only deal with a few shots against such a level of monsters before her mana ran out. She tried shooting at a level 8, using perfect aim to hit its weak spot. Killed Sancha LV8, plus 220 experience, plus 220 copper. One shot and it fell down, unfortunately. Althea looked at her stats and saw that one attack took nearly half her mana. Tusk. She did not continue what she had been doing and let the sentries fire continuously to weaken them. She didn't want to use any of the few bombs she made, either. There were so few, who knew when they'd really need the bombs instead. Besides, the monsters now were troublesome, but still manageable. They were the perfect whetstones for her and her people. Of course, the premise of something being classified as practice was that they wouldn't die for it. The monsters continued trying to hit the wall for a while longer, and her eyes caught a monster that was continuously protected from damage, shielded from the sentries by hiding behind the body of its companion. She narrowed her eyes, feeling something different here. Was it because it was a level higher than the others? It was at this time that Rowan, Oslo, and Drake joined her on the wall battlement, watching the monsters hit the walls continuously without regard for the sentry arrows shooting them. Level 5 sentries could easily take on level 10 without taking much damage, with slightly discounted attacking damage with stronger monsters. This damage further decreased until the monster was level 30. The dozen or so monsters were reduced to about 7. It was around this time that a smarter monster, the monster from before, seemed to have noticed the futility of their attacks and roared loudly. The next moment, the weakened, but surviving monsters ran just out of the sentry's reach. Althea's eyebrows rose. So smart, a few monsters followed it, and they stood menacingly in the safety outside the walls. There was a total of 7 monsters there, 6 level 8 and the 1 level 9 intellectual one. However, that was quite a smart move, in contrast to the mindless blood thirst of weaker monsters. Are they supposed to be smart? She asked Rowan, who had found his way next to her. No, Ms. Althea, he said, but there are indeed very, very few cases where some leading monsters gained a bit of intellect. Althea looked at him curiously, waiting for more information. There have been sightings, especially in cities. I didn't think I'd see one in a village. What are the implications? She asked, emerald eyes staring at the distant monsters. Highly troublesome. If 5 was usually needed to take a monster of the same level, such type may need more, sometimes twice of that. Althea paused, looking at the thing. Has anyone tried to tame them? Oslo blinked, surprised. However, he nodded in the end. Yes, there were people, especially beast tamers, who tried. After all, intellectual monsters ought to be easier to take and more useful to keep, however. Without exemption, they all failed. Almost each attempt caused the deaths of the beast masters. Althea nodded and turned back to the monsters standing still not too far from the walls. What caused this? Oslo thought for a while. The current observation was that other than strength and talent, these monsters also consumed massive amounts of ether. Althea's eyes sharpened, continuing his words. It means they killed much more than the others. Well, whatever these monsters were, there was no way she'd let one roaming around the territory. Wouldn't that just trap people inside? Her emerald eyes looked at the monster, and then turned to the other two next to him. Rowan, Oslo, she said, can you weaken them enough for the others? Anyway, they couldn't gain any experience from them, might as well carry the guards to level up like rockets. The two men looked at each other in understanding, while Drake felt complicated. He also wanted to fight, but he could only be carried. As a former soldier, could it be comfortable? But getting stronger was still the priority. The two Aborigines quickly jumped down the nearly 6-meter-tall wall, without fear and very gracefully. Rowan softened his fall by using a strong flamethrower blazing out both hands, like a human rocket. Oslo, on the other hand, built platforms halfway through, albeit stemming from the ground. Apparently, the wall could not grow any soil, metal, or any other solids made by elementalists. This was a little inconvenient now, but this was generally actually a good thing for those inside. After all, who'd want Earth users to build access above the walls during wars? This was apparently a quality of system buildings, or more accurately, ether buildings in general. This was why Oslo could only ever help with manual construction, and never with buildings made by the system, like the custom houses. Anyway, moving back to the battle, the two Aborigines sprinted towards the monsters, who immediately lunged at them as soon as they went beyond the sentry range. Oslo immediately made metallic spikes, while Rowan made a flame wall. However, when the level 9 noticed this, it moved farther. It didn't run, but just waited at a distance, far enough from the men so much stronger than he was. Seeing most of the monsters being dealt with, Drake called all the guards level 6 to join the fight. All level 6 personnel in the territory except Ansel were all guards, so all 12 people went down to join the fight. There were 4 level 8 monsters to be dealt with, excluding the level 9 that was looming nearby. When Drake and the rest got closer, the two Aborigines hit the monster's knees to discount their movements. They then stood between them and the level 9, lest it decided to attack in unexpected times. The guards fought against the weakened monsters, with Rowan and Oslo stepping in only when the attack was judged life-threatening and could not be avoided. Each of the 4 weakened level 8 had 3 level 6's Alterans to fight them. In all accounts, this still was extremely dangerous, even when the monsters were greatly weakened. However, the Alterans still fought well, strategizing and maximizing each other's strengths. They had grouped themselves in a way that could maximize their chances, i.e. with one main attacker, one long-ranged attacker, archer or spearman, and one with the best defense, ideally a shieldsman. In one team there was no shieldsman, so Hugo extended his spear to stop a monster, defending his teammates, with Helios was dealing with the same monster as the main attacker. The other 3 monsters were handled similarly, though for a while it was mostly just them, avoiding deadly attacks from the strong beasts. Nearby, Drake took out his shield to protect a team member. Shield reinforcement, he chanted, and for that moment his barely a level D shield improved its performance, easily taking in 2 attacks from the monster, allowing his teammate, Amos, to attack it from the side while it was distracted. Amos poked his spear repeatedly at the monster, trying to damage it the best he could. Thanks to Drake's distraction, his blade was fortunately able to stab to a narrow gill-like thing on the monster's rib area, likely his ears. Splurge! Raw! It yelled, flailing wildly. Amos barely managed to avoid it by jumping back, but its pained movements were quick and sudden, and not everyone was able to avoid its body. It happened that its hit connected with Drake, whose shield had returned to normal, and he was pushed several meters away, deeper into the forests. It was at this moment that the level 9 intellectual monster decided to lunge forward. The two aborigines cursed and were about to go to his rescue when... "I'll take it." Swoosh! An arrow flew, redirecting the monster's attack, saving Drake's life. Althea rushed past the aborigines and into the monster's attacking range. They didn't expect Ms. Althea to jump down to attack the level 9 monster on her own. At this point, the level 9 monster had only been partially weakened by Oslo before it escaped farther away. 3 of its legs were still working, and its health should still be mostly filled. Althea was only level 8, and going against it was extremely dangerous. Ms. Althea, they couldn't help but exclaim. How could they bear watch such a delicate, beautiful woman who just gave birth deal with the strongest monster? Althea had long been chewing on a mana cookie, and after waiting for a while of watching the others fight, her lost mana had recovered by a bit. She had her Bellagio out and hit the monster lunging at Drake, reducing its remaining life by half. It also drained much of her mana, so she took more cookies while she changed her weapon to the katana, upgrade to D-class by the weapon maker Brenda. The weapon was made of Terran steel with no special effects. The system classified it as a weapon with a level D material, but gave it an overall rank of upgraded level. Of course, to deal any decent damage to monsters, it had to be heavily improved by Brenda, the new C-class weapons maker. Ironically, this showed how Xeno iron was more effective than Terran steel in this world, despite the latter being a superior material. She had actually studied this, and judged the composition of iron to still be weaker than her steel. She can only attribute it to the fact that weapon makers could input the Xeno-exclusive force called ether to the weapons, making them more effective. It was a magical thing, and she hoped to study this mysterious force someday. Anyway, for now, like any other level E weapon, the katana could now be used up to level 10, but its effectiveness heavily depended on the user. With a bit more confidence, she started to parry her sword while avoiding the monster's sharp claws. It was really, really fast, and it damaged her outer clothing a bit. However, she had rainbow silk undergarments, so she wasn't worried about showing anything. As for the Medina robe, she didn't wear it for now, as it could be used to pull her instead. At the moment, it was being worked on and modified by Letty to allow its use during closed-range fights. She was hyper-focused and got used to the monster's speed. She naturally didn't think she could deal with it easily. After all, not only was it a level higher than her, but also the fact that it was a beast that could take on 10 people of the same level. However, considering everything, she was doing very well. She hadn't given damage after the Bellagio shot, but she hadn't been injured either. She had not formally trained in using the katana, but she had been depending on it for life for so many days. Partnered with her fencing knowledge, she developed a more innate understanding of it, and was able to use it with increasing skill with every battle she fought. Although struggling, she had managed to defend herself in plenty of dangerous attacks, which was much more than what the guards had been doing. The people watching were in awe. They just thought Althea was awesome with her super bow, but they never saw her in close combat. "Focus," Rowan yelled, saving one from being eaten due to the moment's distraction. Sorry," the man yelled, and most of the others flinched and fully focused on their own fights. However, Ansel couldn't help but still be distracted, and the Aborigines couldn't blame him. Oslo and Rowan's eyes met, and they nodded, with Rowan staying to watch over the others, while Oslo would guard Althea's safety. Back to Althea's fight, she still couldn't see a way to deal damage until she recovered enough mana to use the bow again, but she didn't want to be too dependent on it. She tried thinking of ways, but it didn't help that, from her peripheral vision, she could see a lot of people staring in her direction with worried faces. Ansel was even nicked because of his distraction. "Focus on your own fights," she yelled and slashed the sword to guard from another maul. "You're distracting me." Rowan glared at the few who still wouldn't listen. "Did you hear her? You're not helping. It's like you forgot we are here." "Ah, right." Seeing her fine, the others reluctantly turned away and fought the other monsters together. They knew the Aborigines wouldn't let her get too hurt, anyway. The guards then turned and fully focused on their own fights. Their momentum increased, knowing a brave woman was in a direr situation than they were. Drake awakened a shieldsman occupation, Ansel and Helios had awakened the swordsman occupation, while Hugo was a spearman. During the previous Beast Tide, a lot of people awakened new skills. Now, they decided to use their skills to improve their damage and to practice the skills as well. Hugo used a skill called Cyclone Guard, where a small attack field would be produced as he circled the spear around him. It was also a fitting name for a wind user. It was estimated that he could incorporate the element well into this when he awakened. It also looked quite impressive. It was just that it took a good bulk of his mana. Helios learned a skill called Etherwave Slash, where a wave of ether attack was formed with a swing, extending his reach and damage. And then there was Ansel, who learned a variation called Resonant Strike, wherein the force took place after a slash on the body, a belated reaction of sorts, and could be harder to guard against if used well. On the other hand, Drake used his sword to parry, and then, using his clutch-customized iron shield, he activated his new shieldsman's skill, Small Reflect, which could reflect 1% of attacks, lasting for a minute. He reflected the damage that was heading to Ansel, before joining the redhead in his attacks. The two Aborigines stayed not far away from them, watching their moves with complicated expressions. They couldn't help but marvel at these people's growth. Although people could indeed trigger fighting occupations easier than life occupations as long as level 5 was reached, it was not too easy. At least, to their knowledge, less than 40% of people who specialized in a weapon ended up triggering the respective occupation. This was an important distinction, as they would be able to inherit skills Class C and above. The majority just settled with the low-level skills they could get by practicing the weapon for years, calling themselves swordsmen, shieldsmen, etc., despite not being stamped by the system as such. But Alterans, as long as they reached level 5, they will more or less trigger a fighting occupation. Some of them weren't even formally trained in their weapons, they just learned as they fought. Just what kind of minds do the Lord and her people have, Prev? Next, Althea's solo fight with the intelligent level 9 monster naturally wasn't as smooth. Although the Aborigines helped and discounted another one of the monster's legs, it was a level stronger than the Lord. But what could they do? The Lord asked them to stay put, unless real and lasting damage to any of them was about to happen. The two of them could only watch the fights with bated breath. Meanwhile, Althea chewed on her mana cookies as she swung her sword to weaken the thing. Eventually, her mana managed to recover enough to use a skill. It was called Triple Shot, and she got it from one of her grinding sessions in the training hall. Triple Shot D, -10 mana. The Bellagio bow let out an odd sheen, releasing 3 shots at the same time, congregating on a single sensitive shot. It was so strong that the monster was pushed back by a feet or two. It roared in anger, lunging at Althea in rage. She avoided it with a smile, knowing the attack had successfully taken away a good portion of the monster's life. Meanwhile, the two Aborigines gaped. Oslo couldn't stop himself and manifested a large earth wall between them so they could ask. Was that the triple shot, my lord? It was Rowan who threw the question, and Oslo nodded as he looked at her. You're an archer as well. Yes, she seems to have been using the bow and arrow since the beginning, right, and put down this wall. What she didn't know was that, even if the skill was a level D skill, it was an archer-exclusive one. That was to say, normal archers would never be able to use it. But aren't you a pharmacist? Yes, and, she asked, and like I said, put down the wall. How could she have known that, for some reason, indigenous people generally only have one? Anyway, Oslo did eventually take down the wall, and Althea avoided the monster's maul by shifting her center of gravity, using the inertia to turn. She managed to hit the monster's eye. It did a minimal damage due to her lack of mana, but it was accurate enough to cause some damage, making it even angrier. The two of them went to and fro like this, and although the monster's life had been greatly discounted at this time, Althea still didn't feel the momentum shifting completely to her direction either. In fact, she felt the damage to her side was increasing. As time passed, her clothes got more and more torn and bloodied. It was fortunate that her defense equipment was fabulous, especially with her Class A underwear. Otherwise she'd have teared up her layers of clothing, a sight that would make Garen want to stab the eyes of all men there. Anyway, she still underestimated a monster a few levels higher than she was, not to mention one with a bit of brain, so it always managed to get out of a pinch whenever she felt like she could get a good shot. Unlike the others that attacked head-on despite falling into disadvantage, this one knew when to back off and bide its time. For instance, because half of its legs were painful, it wouldn't attack when she was on his weak sides. It would just guard, ready to bite her head off if she dared to attack. It had to be noted that, even with its legs in pain, it wasn't slow, and its bite was still just as strong. The fight became stagnant, and they just continued to send attacks and defend, attack and defend, and so on. This went on until she lost her balance due to its strength, and was almost mauled. The monster's feet were sucked into the ground before it could reach her, with her back supported by strong arms. It was Oslo, looking at her with a very worried look on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "HMN, thanks," she said. She got out of his grasp and jumped back to the fight. Oslo could only sigh and watch as closely as he could, hopefully to help her avoid any more injuries. The monster soon broke through the ground and the two stared off for a while. She looked at its three menacing fangs jutted from its massive upper body, angry, while her sword was high and ready to strike at an instant's notice. In a swift motion, the monster lunged forward and its fangs directed to eat her midsection. She dodged to the side, the monster's momentum carried it past her, and she quickly turned. Using its blind side, she took advantage of its distraction to stab the nearest weak spot, its butthole. "And also you." It screamed and jumped in pain. She ran farther and it rushed to her with a painful limp. Unfortunately, she too wasn't any less bloodied, but she gritted her teeth and tried to outrun the damned thing. The berserk monster pretty much teleported to her, mouth open to eat her whole. She jumped back to increase the distance between them, even at the expense of hurting her back a bit. With a deep breath, she took out the Bellagio for a final shot, and she felt time slow down a bit due to the extreme adrenaline. At this moment, she took the shot. Swish! But she saw its angle was skewed and knew for sure that she aimed incorrectly. Her heart skipped a beat, and it felt like she was floating in midair at that moment. She could see Oslo run to catch her from her peripheral vision, but her eyes were fixed on the arrow that was about to pass the monster. It felt like time ran so slow that the short distance the arrow traveled felt extremely long. Then the arrow's path suddenly curved a little and hit it straight through the monster's mouth and to its brain. Killed, Sancha LV9, plus 250 experience, plus 250 copper. Learned curved shots C, shoot with variance of up to 1.5 m radius, plus 20% attack. Mana, 30 mana. Learned mana reduction C, passive skill, reduce mana consumption by half for a period of 1 minute. Say D, 50 minutes. 2 skills and both C-class. "Are you all right, my lord?" Oslo whispered rashly, holding her with shaking arms, only belatedly realizing she had been caught from falling to the ground. But her legs gave way, and so Oslo completely held her weight. "Thank you," she said, realizing she could barely move. She checked on her stats and realized how low her life and spirit was. She quickly took her medicine and sighed, watching so many of the guards team up against each one. Although they were finishing up, it could be seen by how they were struggling to hold their weapons that it was an extremely hard fight. "So much work for such a small mob," she mumbled, standing up after feeling some energy return to her. Oslo's azure eyes traced over his arm that had held her warmth, before shifting to look at her. He heaved a sigh and walked over, leaning down a bit so their eyes were leveled. He looked at her warmly. "You shouldn't feel too much pressure," he told her. "The leveling within the territory is already very fast. To be honest, I have never seen anything like it." Althea blinked and looked at him, slightly apprehensive and obviously wondering if he was just trying to comfort her. "Really?" "HMN," he nodded. "Don't put too much pressure on yourself, my lord. You're already doing marvelously." She smiled. "Thank you for saying so, Oslo," she said, with a particularly bright smile made even more colorful by her relief. Oslo looked on in a daze, even when she had already walked past him. Ansel, who had also ran to her, saw the whole thing and sighed. Now he just pitied this dude. The group took the monsters back. Their carcasses contained a lot of usable materials inside the gates. "Are you sure you're all right?" Ansel asked his sister, now covered with a coat of sorts. He was supporting her shoulders and she was leaning on him. He was heartbroken, but he knew having to fight like that was a necessary evil. "Yeah," Althea said, "now I just want to see my Barbies." Ansel smiled in understanding, also looking dazed at the recollection of his cute niece and nephew, and just led the woman through the gate. But when they entered, they were a little startled by the crowd that had been waiting for them, immediately cheering as the gates closed. "Amazing! Bravo! I was terrified to see such large monsters, especially when I heard of their level, but looks like we can still handle it. Nothing to be scared of. We don't need the protection period anymore." The crowd had been watching the fights from the safety of the walls. However, even if they did want to help, their skills and levels would just designate them as burdens instead. At the same time, people from the health clinic arrived with all the tools needed to perform first aid, bringing the heavily injured guards back for more intensive care. The crowd looked at the group, especially Althea, with fanatic admiration. She had spearheaded the economic and agricultural development of the territory, and now she joined the guards to vanguard against the strongest monsters they had ever encountered so far. And then they realized that she was the strongest non-Aborigine. It was unbelievable. Just what can't she do? With these thoughts, they couldn't help but want to express admiration in one form or another. There were plenty of words of encouragement and affirmation, and there were also a lot of people who gave their stock medicines to those who fought, and none of them were rejected. Of course, not everyone was amazed. For example, Ramona, who was gritting her teeth in the crowd. During the fight, in contrast with the aghast gasps and worried prayers when Althea got wounded, Ramona was holding back smiles. Ramona frowned, glaring at Althea's bloodied figure. Even all bloodied, she was so beautiful, so admired. And why was she still so strong? She was the strongest other than the Aborigines. Ramona simmered on the side with a dark expression. "What's wrong, wife?" a plain-looking man asked her in concern. She had, of course, found a new man who did most of the work in their household, one who made all of the money with her in charge of taking care of the household, i.e. buying whatever she wanted. He was even working as a staff of the glorious hospitality company and was making quite a bit in commissions. She had been living amply, much better than how it was in Bright. However, more than once she passed by outside Althea's house, and she could see the wonderful colors inside, even from outside the fences. She could often hear laughter inside, though mostly by the children playing, and she could imagine the fabulous life she still had. In comparison, her own life paled again. How could Ramona be satisfied? Althea looked at the surrounding crowd, who were in a celebratory mood. She didn't want to put a damper on it, but she felt that she had to. She shook her head and looked at them, waiting for them to calm down. Under her stare, they did. "The new average of the monsters outside is level 7. I hope everyone, fighters or not, will try to gain strength on their own," she said, her emerald orbs filled with seriousness. "We only won because the Aborigines are here. What if they aren't? What if they couldn't? Territory wars had level limits. They knew this. She had to remind them of this." The reminder, indeed, successfully put a damper in the celebration. Silence reigned the area for a while. "It is still best to strengthen ourselves without relying on anyone," she said, heaving a sigh. "I'm sure the territory will help decrease the risks as it could, but of course, it wouldn't be unavoidable. I hope everyone braves through it, because the monsters would only get stronger." She looked at the others and they gestured to continue back to their homes. Before leaving the crowd, Althea couldn't help but add her last advice to them. "Be stronger, it will be the only way to keep what we have now." Later that day, after a good bath, rest, and bonding with the Barbies, the siblings met again in the study room. Althea and Ansel looked at the territory map, which was now much larger than it was before. Paper now had preliminary products, though not enough to sell. For now, it was basically used only by her and the departments. Oslo's architecture and engineering team would definitely be consuming the bulk of it. Graphite had also been discovered near a marble deposit by one of the adventurers just before the protection period ended. With graphite, they could also formulate ink and create pencils. However, because the missions to safe harvest were limited, ink and pencils were also in limited supply, mostly exclusive to the territorial departments. In any case, in front of them was a hand-drawn map of the territory, drawn by Althea herself, primarily because she was currently the only one who knew the bird's-eye view of this place. Ansel's eyes dilated at the sight of the map, extremely impressed. Wow, huge area, he said, eyes tracing over the large expanse of land. I want to maximize every inch. I'm thinking of increasing the greening to 40%, she said. This was very ambitious, but their goal had always been to build vertically. For Althea, this was not a pipe dream. She wanted a higher percentage of this, because this also included the natural forest resource points that had to be maintained. Not only would they be safer for the citizens to harvest, but they lacked the dangerous poison plants and insects that were abundant in the forests outside. Don't think of it as too much. These were all providers of quick refresh resources. All in all, while it seemed like an overkill, she believed it wouldn't be a stupid decision to do so. Her intuition told her so. And eventually, she would be proven wise. Althea had also decided to continue with the old plans, before adding the system buildings so as to not be too dependent on them. The land has expanded, but she was able to decide on the direction of its expansion. Rather than a circle, the land was more like a very irregular rectangle, mostly extending to occupy more river and flat lands, as well as the mountains north. She also decided to add another consideration with this expansion: underground construction. It wasn't that they didn't consider before, but the tree roots were too dense, and they didn't want to risk weakening the foundation of buildings. Now was the perfect time to do so. The mountain areas northward was also a bit enlarged. Other than safeguarding the springs, this was also to occupy a resource point for hemp, which was currently being developed to make fabric and paper. She still hoped to find something like flax though, as linen was smoother and didn't need to be ironed. There were several clothing types more suited to it. It was also highly absorbent, more comfortable than hemp, and it was also more durable and breathable than cotton. Anyway, having the 3 types of cloth in addition to animal hides would provide the territory with enough necessary variety. Next was the arrangement of the roads. Following her new greening rule in the urbanized areas, she maintained the planted sidewalks, road islands, and parks. The farmlands were expanded twice its current size, and she invested in more fields. The earlier it was bought, the better, as it raked in more profits. The industrial park also planned to build several more factories for rent. Speaking of factories, because it was public knowledge that Althea requested factories to be built, and Gru's public domain farmlands had been approved by the village system, there had been a number of other building requests, some of which were actually pretty good, and were thus slated to be added in the territory. One was to create a small fishing port along the river. Although people could fish here conditionally, comfort would be nice since they'd stay for hours. Some transportation routes would also be added here, though mostly with small boats and canoes. The person who suggested was a man named Bull, who she heard was someone from Vismont before. He was asking to make a business out of it. Not only would he transport goods or people along this long river chord, he also proposed scenic routes. Althea naturally approved of this. Similarly, there were also proposals to add artificial river routes heading deeper into the luxury areas and form a small lake. The person who suggested it was from Sylvia and her brother Reno's team. Reno was one of Drake's men in the guard team, while Sylvia was an official under Mathilda, so the business would be primarily handled by their teammates. The leading team member, Honey Guevara, happened to discover a relatively non-porous material that could be used like geomats to keep water in a certain place without leaking into the soil. As for why the use of the material was limited to this, rather than other applications, was because it was strong only when it was in contact with water. Further, it could only be placed in fragile thin layers. From Sheila's gossip, Honey was collecting weird materials to try to get them approved as resources when she accidentally fell into the river in her excitement. Unexpectedly, she touched an unusual surface very different from the rocky texture she was expecting, and spent days investigating until she and her team figured it out. She called it water blocker. Because land could not be privately owned, however, Althea simply awarded the woman with huge contribution points, a whopping 5,000, and priority to rent commercial land adjacent to the lake. Her story did inspire a lot of people, and it was partly because of her that they found a lot of resources just before the protection period ended. Of course, while she approved of this, as someone with a better grasp of the terrain, she changed the location of the artificial lake to more natural basins. This was to let it double as water collector during strong rainfalls to prevent flooding. After this was settled, the siblings focused on the other side of the river. Althea and Ansel also made some plans for these areas. The river bent slightly north, so the last section of the river that was still within the territory connected closely with the farmlands. At this, Althea paused, thinking of another improvement. She added another river branch. She read somewhere about a technique of integrating fish ponds into fields, forming a sustainable ecosystem on its own, rice fish culture. This was a farming system that integrated the cultivation of rice and fish in the same field. Fish benefited from the rice, using them as shelter and food. The rice plant, in turn, benefits from the fish by having them control pests and provide nutrients through their waste. Better, what if the fish grew better because they lived on system fields? Definitely worth the try, Ansel said. Althea nodded and added it to the agenda. After all, they still needed to figure out if the rice could survive such an arrangement. Next, there was also someone who requested daycare, so their children could have some place to socialize and learn. Adults were too busy to care too much, after all. This was especially true now that most of them had to hunt outside a few hours a week. There were now over 3,000 people in her territory, about a score of which were children under 7 years old. It was more than before, and she made a mental note to send a task to Rosalind later. As for the others, the modules and factories were extremely flexible and could be modified as needed. For instance, a more popular baker in the territory requested larger kilns, as the current demands could no longer be met. This could be rectified by the person buying bigger units and placing larger kilns. The luxury areas also increased a little, while the areas between the center and the southwest gate increased the most. She got a lot of rich citizens since the last visit of the 3 territories. She also added narrower streets perpendicular to the avenues every 2 blocks or so, adding a few more pedestrian-only streets by the way. She assigned more areas for stalls. Now that the basic raw materials were basically completed, a lot of industries were expected to rise. There were already different shops for clothing, shoes, bags, etc. booming. Different types of foods, different types of furnishings, and different services were already flourishing. When rubber became commercially available, even more industries would rise. Of course, there was still a lot of study of local resin to be done. She really wished Winona was here already. Anyway, there should be more demand on the commercial side, and she should be filling up the main avenues again. Except for the areas along avenues, she basically didn't build much anymore. For now, the residences were enough, and she just needed to add another dormitory. There was plenty of construction left, and she didn't want to expand to the next level up. The level 5 walls were very expensive, and she didn't need such a large area anyway. Her next goal was to find a way to safely build high-rise buildings. They might have limestone deposits as they were near water sources, but she searched to find out it was a long shot. Concrete was still integral if they wanted to build even taller. Her target was at least 10 floors. Unfortunately, it would be hard to find limestones as the river was freshwater, rather than seawater. However, it wasn't impossible, but just very hard. At worst, she'd have to find another alternative somewhere. The one she used in the module was basically just for grout, not structural concrete. It would be better if the curing time of concrete was reduced. She read in her tablet that a batch could take days, so a building would take months or even years to finish. Her theory about the latest Aborigine hire reducing time was still a theory after all, and she couldn't take it as fact already. She didn't have that time, and neither did the territory. And then there was steel, which would only work if they could find more iron sources. That too would take time. Fortunately, she saw the new buildings, and there was a good alternative she could use while this aspect was being studied. Anyway, she didn't build any more buildings for now. Instead, she turned to look at the system buildings that came with the upgrade. "I've ignored you long enough," she mused. Ansel watched as the beautiful Althea gracefully pressed on her screens. He found it fascinating even if he couldn't see what she was seeing. Also, judging by her movements, her screen seemed to be at least twice as theirs. He was very, very curious about the Lord panel, so he ended up asking a lot of questions like, how big is it? What could you see? Or is it also sparkly? Partnered with his large, wistful eyes, Althea just thought her little brother was so pitiful that she hoped she could show it to him. She thought for a moment and nodded to herself, looking at her baby brother with seriousness. "Or we attack back whoever attacks our territory. I'll give you the Lord token," she said, very blunt. Later. Ansel was genuinely touched, but he just laughed and shook his head. "I'm a businessman and not a leader. I'd rather make money here with you than take on that responsibility." Althea smiled and Ansel cheekily served her another cup of tea and snacks. As he did so, his eyes stayed on the large map and his brain turned. Their territory was becoming really, really good. People ought to pay more. I think it's time to adjust the prices. There's no need to have the equivalence of contribution points anymore. Oh, people could afford it now. Besides, the luxuries Althea provided is no longer the same as before. Housing prices ought to increase as well, he said, placing a cookie in his mouth. Of course, we will be improving the terms of payment to make it accessible to normal people. I wonder if we can develop a bank or loan system as well. There was already an IOU system in the clinic. Why not apply to anywhere else? Althea nodded, thinking that it made sense. Yes, elder of finance and economics. Ansel grinned. The two discussed the new prices and rationale, as well as the adjustment in the value of contribution points. After their chat, Althea looked at the screen in thought. Since price raise was inevitable, then let's make this price increase 100% unquestionable. She looked at the updated tabs in the Lord panel to see the new buildings available to them as a newly minted level 3 village. To be honest, when she saw the buildings before the mob, she thought that they were neither disappointing nor exciting, so she ignored them for a bit and focused on the preparation for the upcoming fight. There were still new residential houses, new food stores and drink stores. There were now clothing stores and shoe stores, too, albeit it was indicated that the clothing store was the lowest level using coarse cloth and would probably only provide the better fabric upon leveling up. This was a new addition, though, as the Aborigines mentioned before that there was no such thing. This was very interesting as, apparently, additions in options didn't occur often, at most once every few years. She later found from Oslo that there really was a way for people or organizations to create building types, wherein they would get a lot of money when it was built, and used regardless of how far the purchasing territory was. In Terran terms, it was basically franchising, only much more convenient and magical. Oslo didn't know the details, however, though he mentioned he'd try to find out during his day off. Although his family didn't have the Lord token, they had some relations to their city lord. The bookstore was also now available, and it was not charming at all. As mentioned before, it only sold plain papyrus and ink for a hefty price. Not everything was a waste, however. The improvement among the options was that there were now fish ponds, taverns, parks and prisons. These were all basic buildings that many territories would love, but were not so special in Althea, which could build all these by itself. In fact, she just used the options as an alert of what she could add, in case she missed anything. For instance, the prison. The ether priosin was very strong and could hold prisoners up to level 50. It also slowly took ether of people inside the cells. It was very minuscule every day, but deadly in the long term. In Xeno, this was akin to taking people's lifespans. While intrigued, she didn't buy it in the end. Not only was it expensive, she had no need for such an inhumane building. As for the others, she literally had them all in the territory already. The difference was the convenience of magic, of course. For instance, system fish ponds increased the size, fecundity, and nutrition of fish by 20% at level 1. System taverns had automatic refilled cups, as long as gougy fruit raw materials were often provided. In the end, she just opted to save her 2 new building slots. There should be more powerful buildings available when the territory was upgraded to a town. Shifting tabs, she went to the infrastructure section to see there was also an addition. There was a new stone road called Redstone. In the information, it said it could withstand a mob of level 30 monsters for 10 days. Her eyes brightened at this. Someday a lot of carriages would go through here. Although she heard from the Aborigines that only rich towns and cities had this, because the services of beast tamers were so expensive and so rare, it didn't make her falter at all. Even if they didn't get beasts, they could someday, even if it would take decades, build cars instead. Or maybe both. She was a bit ambitious in this regard. She overlaid it with the existing carriageway, and more than half of the resources used in the old roads were automatically recycled. Outside, she could hear the oohs and ahs of the people, admiring the beauty of the red stones. She and Ansel looked at each other with raised eyebrows, standing up to look out to see the sight. It was more pink than red, but it blended well with the peach-colored sidewalk, the calming green of the forest, and the erratically colored stone walls and wood of the custom buildings. Very colorful, she loved it. And lastly, she turned her attention to the last tab and her precious alternative to the creation of taller buildings. Her new custom building, the new custom building slot, was quite magnificent. It was more than thrice the size of the original one, and 5 times as expensive. The new custom building had a maximum total floor area of 1,000 SQM, which meant she could do a lot more than before. Just a pity that it came with a maximum height of 10 meters, so she couldn't go to the ideal 8 or so floors. With this, only 3 floors could be made, maybe 4 at best, which was just the same height as the manually created inns. However, the system buildings were built for the weather or conditions here. That was to say, even if she built slightly taller, she didn't have to worry about the gravity here or earthquakes. This was a major plus, even if it was costlier. Of course, she now had civil engineers in the territory, so they could make the necessary calculations regarding this, just having to remind them of the new gravity quotient they had to deal with. She told Ansel about this and he threw out his opinion. I suggest 4. The original custom building should still be a luxury. We can make these 4 floors smaller with smaller areas per room, and at a much more affordable rate. Although the design rate was expensive, the per-unit costs should still be fair, so they didn't need to charge too much. Althea thought it made sense. She's studying a bit and making some preliminary plans. When she and Ansel decided on the final ceiling heights and unit cuts, she sent a private mission to Eugene and Oslo's teams to help her iron out the details and technicalities. When the team arrived, they were a bit surprised to see them, although they just quickly assumed the village system just sent her the same mission as it did to them. Anyway, without further ado, they went to work to create a preliminary design, including planning of utilities and other considerations. Because of its height, the water tower had to be above the roof deck. As for how they put water up the tanks, they used not only siphoning, but something called hydraulic ramp pump. The challenge was that they needed some good metallurgy work to make pathways that could withstand the water pressure. As for the other systems, similar ones from before were retained and fitted for the new arrangement. For example, waste treatment was common for the entire building. This meant that the resulting biogas was shared in the building and would therefore be bought per usage, with the funds earned used to help maintain the building. It also had features for natural ventilation like atriums, naturally ventilated hallways, and sky gardens. There were also provisions to cover these openings with Yuli stone slabs in case of exceptionally cold winters. A whole community was built using this module, and it was estimated a lot of people from the dormitories would jump in queue. As such, the middle-class studio units and one-bedroom small condominiums were born. There were actually plenty of buildings she hoped to build, and Althea had specifically left a lot of space for these buildings. Although she could manually build them like always, not only would it take time, but it would need a lot more resources and also waste potential. This world had allowed people to create miracles through buildings. How could she not tap it? Speaking of magic buildings, she turned to stare at Oslo, who was startled by her stare. When are you going to level up to C? Soon, he said. He wasn't lying. The level that had been stuck for so many years was finally showing progress inside this unique village and under its unique lord. You must know, because of the incredible rarity of their pertinent materials needed to create ether buildings, architects had a much more difficult time to upgrade than others. Most architects, in fact, remained stagnant at Class D for their lifetimes, which was very poor compared to most other professions who could reach their peaks at Class C. And now, he was going beyond that at the young age of 30. His eyes met the Lord's and smiled. This was all thanks to her and her people. Althea was just relieved to know he was upgrading soon. Good, she said and handed him the tablet. She opened up all the architecture-related books for reference. I'll lend this to you. You can study it within the village center library. Growing up with a holographic screen in his head, the tablet naturally wasn't too magical. But its contents were. And it was still in the language he grew up with. Thanks to the Aborigines, Althea and many others had already learned the local alphabet system. When books were popularized, others would learn of them too. With that knowledge, she had transcribed it to her high-functional tablet, allowing it to automatically translate the books so Aborigines would understand. I thank you, Oslo said, a bit shaky. He knew it must not have been easy to collect all this knowledge and make it available to him. Although Aborigines could not betray hiring territories even if they wanted to, this level of trust was unprecedented. He was actually only required to stay hired for a month by the family, but now he just wanted to stay to watch its development indefinitely. He then excused himself to settle on the top floor of the village center, and he wouldn't be coming out for many, many days. Of course, his food delivery would still be exclusively from Cook's or Harold's, but that was a story for later. At the moment, Althea was looking at her building tabs to study the upgrade conditions for various buildings. During the height of the beast tide, she had received several notifications. It was just that she was too busy to care for them. Then she forgot about it while preparing for the lift. The condition of the upgrade for the bathhouse, LV1, was accumulated use of 10,000 hours. Considering how many days it had been built, how many people actually used it every day, she didn't count anymore. All she knew was that it was raking in profit. The training hall was still a bit far from an upgrade, but the progress was very good. The hall witnessed a natural surge after her announcement. She estimated it would be upgraded within the next few days. The warehouse, though, was finally eligible for an upgrade at this time. It was 10 times more expensive than the previous one, but she still bought it. With her mind's eye, she looked at the changes in the warehouse and was pleasantly surprised. The warehouse, LV3, was larger with 1,000 square meters and 5 meters in height. What was amazing was that the area outside was unchanged, as if the space within the warehouse could expand indefinitely without affecting the building outside. This was basically a type of space folding right. She wanted to know more about that. It also had an automatic sorting function. The categories were vague, but it was enough. For instance, she could separate rocks, wood, plants, and others, which would make her occasional rummaging for treasure much easier. In a good mood, Althea took another look at the basic improvements of the territory with a smile. Territory stats. Status Level 3 Village. Area 12,566,400 square meters. Residents 1415, 373 permanent, 1042 temporary. Total population 3524. Base resources. Wood 702,0000. Stone 201,5000. Money 10,711 gold, 14,699 silver, 898,699 copper. Reputation 150. Buildings, Village Center LV3, Weaponry Shop LV3, Defensive Wall LV5, Warehouse LV3, Farm LV2, Training Hall LV1, Bathhouse LVQ. Bonus Building, Custom Buildings 2. Building Slots 7, 9 plus 2. The village was upgrading, and so were its people. And that was good enough. Eden University, 5 years prior. Inside a school's laboratory, bathed in the soft sunlight peering through the curtained windows, the beautiful Althea Witt stood in front of a stainless steel table, engrossed in her work. There was a plethora of tools and plants occupying her space. Completely absorbed in her experiments, her emerald eyes focused only on the task at hand. Her ponytailed auburn hair cascaded down her shoulders, her focused expression highlighting the delicate features of her face. When a beaker reacted, she was quick to write down notes on her notebook, filled with formulas and various equations only she could decipher. Here she added complex notations with bright eyes. Nimble fingers carefully adjusted the glassware in front of her with deliberate and practiced movements, and she handled the instruments with gentle confidence. Occasionally, she would brush stray strands of her hair to the back of her ears. The men around her gaped, watching, wanting to do it for her. But the door of the laboratory abruptly opened, and the admiring men quickly turned their attention back to their respective tasks, blush creeping all the way up her ears, as if they'd been caught staring. Althea SOS, help me. Althea blinked, carefully turning off the fire. She turned to look at the beautiful blonde woman who was making such a desperate face. My project, Sobs, the one I've been working on since the beginning of the semester, it won't integrate. And it's based on organic materials, so well. Althea sighed and turned off her own experiments, taking away all her items in the laptop bag. She was then dragged to another lab, helping out her crying best friend. They got out of the lab some 12 hours later, and the two women stretched their arms, with Winona's shifting to wrap around Althea's dainty shoulders. Winona happily rubbed her face against her friend's. Thank you so much, you're the best. I would definitely get those rare plants from the desert country for you. Althea's eyes brightened, but she modestly shook her head. You don't have to. Well, I want to, she grinned, and Althea chuckled. Not too far from them, Ansel was standing, waiting patiently for his sister to get out of the damned laboratory. He frowned as he looked at Winona's arms, occupying so much of Althea's personal space. Winona noticed this stare and stared back, lifting her chin proudly. Althea saw her friend's attention somewhere else and followed her line of sight. She blinked. Ansel. Ansel's dark expression immediately morphed into a gentle one. Raising a nice-looking box in his hand, he approached them. I thought you'd be hungry. Winona looked at him guardedly. This jerk was acting like a boyfriend, while the real boyfriend was abroad likely fighting for his life. Althea was unaware of the electricity exchanged between the two, and she just smiled, taking the box before looking at him again. Thank you, don't you have class? Yes, in 5 minutes, he smiled. I happened to pass by. Well, thanks again. Anything for my sister, he said just before he sauntered away, attracting the stares of all the women he passed. He's not normal, Althea, Winona couldn't help but whisper with a tone of heavy warning. Who couldn't tell his feelings, only Althea right. Also, he looked all wishy-washy around Althea, and then he proceeded to create a string of X's. It was disgusting. Instead, she earned a tap on the forehead. Don't be silly, he's just attached like a chick to his mother. Only you would think that. Winona wanted to yell but didn't do so. But Winona just pursed her lips, knowing Althea wouldn't believe her. Then she had no choice but to just watch that red-headed playboy like a hawk. Altera Village, present. While Althea was discussing the plans with Ansel, there was a sudden knocking on the gates outside. They looked at each other and were about to stand up to take a look. However, they quickly realized that Harold had already let the newcomer in, seeing the guest's flustered state. It was Jesse, one of Baron's cousins, and a guard. The moment he saw Althea, he immediately approached. Ms. Althea, he exclaimed, and Ansel rubbed his ears in surprise. Hey, speak louder, will you? It's not like we're deaf or anything, Ansel mumbled sarcastically. The guard realized his gaffe and blushed. Seeing this, Althea just sighed. What is it, Jesse? Your friend, she's injured. Ms. Lily said to call you immediately. Friend, she voiced out, though she had already stood up and was heading to the door. It's the blonde one from Vismont. What? Althea's pace quickened, heart tightening in anxiety. She was already sweating a bit when she arrived at the health center. Similarly, Ansel was also rushing right beside her, eyes filled with complex emotions. She rushed in, asking where the girl was. The nurse wasn't used to seeing the beautiful Ms. Althea flustered, and she could only hurry and bring her to the patient's bed. Althea's tense shoulders slumped as she saw Winona all in one piece, and being treated as an outpatient. At the very least, it meant her condition was not too critical. As she approached the woman's bed, she saw her current pitiful state, and her heart broke a bit. The girl's body was riddled with bandages, her face was pale, her lips caffed, and her nails broken. Althea sighed. This girl loved beauty the most. She had perfectly manicured fingers, styled hair, well-chosen clothing, and used the most advanced beauty products, before completely converting to her wit beauty products, of course. Althea could only hope that nothing scarred, or the girl would definitely feel sad. Of course, even if it did, then Althea would just have to formulate scar removal creams for her. Althea held the blonde's cold hand, which was unconsciously shaking even when she was asleep. It broke Althea's heart. I'm here, she said, eyes on her best friend's pitiful figure. You're safe again. Althea looked around the room. There were about 5 others in Winona's team according to the attending nurses, and unlike Winona, they were receiving the most urgent care due to their horrible states. Among them, there was an old woman with white hair hyperventilating. She was wrinkled and a bit unsightly, but one could tell from her features that she was very beautiful in her youth. Althea knew that it must be Winona's grandmother. Other than their first residence, this was the first time she had met an old person. Winona really protected her well, despite all the bad-mouthing the girl did behind her back. The others were bloodied, and someone even lost an arm. Lily, Sheila, and Betty were working extra hard to save them. Fortunately, the group stabilized, and except for the one who died on arrival, the other 5 should survive. They're fine, Betty said, obviously overdrawn from using too much ability. Althea kindly gave her exclusive top-quality sprite to help her spirit. Betty blinked as she held on to the well-made porcelain bottle. This was only accessible to Althea's friends, no one else. Betty was extremely touched. "Thank you," she said. Even at her level, the Lord's potion had a very good effect. This was just as she needed. She did not dare mention to pay, however, because value couldn't be attached. Instead, Betty just swore to continue to work hard for the Lord. The siblings sat in the waiting room for a while, chatting as they waited for Winona to finally regain consciousness. Soon, the figure on the bed shifted, and she slowly opened her eyes. Althea's worried face morphed into a relieved smile. "Hey," she said, sitting on the mattress. "How are you feeling?" Winona gaped, startled, and smiled weakly when she realized it was Althea. Could have felt better. Winona was just about to start acting like a baby when her peripheral view caught sight of Ansel, who had been watching their interactions with crossed arms. Winona stiffened a little, and she inexplicably blushed in shame. Althea flinched at her expression, and she couldn't help but feel worried. "What's wrong? Is it painful?" Winona looked at Althea pitifully, and the latter immediately scooted near her and gently patted her head. "Your grandma and most of your teammates are okay. They're recovering." The blonde blinked and looked at her, making Althea smile. "I arranged your home for you. You can move in as soon as you're discharged." "Thank you," Winona said, wrapping her arms around the woman and resting her chin on the other's stomach. From her position, she could see the redhead behind, frowning, and Winona couldn't help but send an arrogant smirk in Ansel's direction. But then she also caught sight of her companions in adjacent beds, and she suddenly remembered she had a mission. She parted from Althea, face uncharacteristically somber. "But there's something else I need to talk to you about." Althea's eyebrows rose in curiosity, but she patted the other girl, telling her to relax. Stress was not good for recovery. Winona shook her head, knowing that the issue was too urgent. "Vismont is asking for help from Altera. Matthew said they're willing to be a subsidiary to Altera if they were rescued." "What?" His NPC told him of this option, and it was the only way he could see for the territory to survive. Matthew started hiring Aborigines late. He didn't have any good ones left to hire. So when the monsters attacked, he could barely hold on. They were lucky the mobs were on the weaker part of the spectrum, only at level 5, which could be handled by level 2 walls and Aborigines to some degree. Otherwise, else they'd have perished even before Winona could reach the gate. In fact, if Althea hadn't given her those weapons, she wouldn't have survived. Her grandmother was with her when they fled. When Matthew found out they were going to Altera, he didn't stop them. Instead, he asked them to send the message and asked 10 guards to guide them. It was just that only a handful were left. Betty, who had been watching from the side, was very surprised by the proposal. Based on her knowledge, subsidiary territories were at least 2 levels lower, more a whole rank different. Territories generally only accepted subsidiaries when they were at town level, because no territories below would be willing to be under them otherwise. This was a big commitment, because this meant their territory would be constrained to pay Altera 10% net income tax every month, no matter what. And why would a territory be willing to be under another? It was in exchange for a little protection or backing. And this help was maneuverable. The superior territory could just send 10 people before the territory war, still within the level cap, and that was it. The contract wouldn't be breached. Those people might even just watch in the sidelines if they wanted to. This was a somewhat unfair trade that usually happened when one territory really needed the protection of the other and couldn't find a better alternative. Althea also seriously considered this. Although Vismont could not compare to her, all territories generate a lot of money. The variance was the economic wealth, infrastructure, and satisfaction of the common people. At least she knew Matthew took care of his people, despite all of his shortcomings. He was worthy to save. "I submitted the request to the territory and received an immediate response," Althea said, playing the role of the Elder Not the Lord role quite well. It agreed, unsurprisingly. "I'll do it, we'll go right now," she said, standing up, and everyone beside her flinched. "Why are you coming?" Ansel asked, and Winona nodded, but was still weak to sit up. "You don't have to come," Winona said. "If it's troublesome, you don't even have to." Althea shook her head to stop her. Althea wasn't being impulsive. Seeing her unchanging state, Winona tried to convince her more. "What about the territory?" It'll be fine without me, she said, confident. The Aborigines mentioned the average level of monsters around villages was level 7 or 8. With Oslo, Drake, and Hugo along with the sentries in the territory, she didn't worry too much. At worst, some low-level secondary fence would be sacrificed again. I want to train more, she told them, and I haven't explored any other territory since coming to Althea. Shouldn't we take a look at the new subsidiary, Bright Territory? Not far away, a battle was just concluding, with a territory lord gracefully finishing off a monster. His sharpened wooden sword stabbed at the eye of an ugly, slimy beast with a flat face, made easier to hit as it was held in place by ice covering its entire leg. Killed Kui LV5, plus 150 experience, plus 150 copper. That is the 700th monster, Garen said, looking at Mitchell who had just pulled away his sword. He had now entered the peak level 7, and he really wanted to find a way to keep them here and let him upgrade a level. But he looked at the man's cloudy azure eyes, and he knew he couldn't ask for this without expecting a beating. In the end, life was more important. Anyway, he had an Aborigine to help him out as well. Fine, he said, I'll open up a purchasing mission to Althea. You can go with them. Anyway, I'm sure many people are looking forward to going back there. Mitchell sighed as he said so, feeling complicated. It was both a good and bad thing to be near such a good territory, but he would probably be losing another bulk of citizens after this. Sigh. You're already doing very well, my lord, Juno kindly said beside him, as if sensing his thoughts. The blonde smiled at the Aborigine, appreciating the gesture. Thanks, he said before turning away and opening his Lord tab to write the much-awaited announcement. Mitchell also set the minimum level to 4, making a rough estimate. There should be a total of about 50 people qualified to go on this mission. He gave a furtive glance at Garen and the others, wondering how many they could protect with ease. Anyway, a familiar ping soon sounded in everyone's heads. Caravan mission to Althea now open. Won't it be too slow? Garen said right beside him. He looked very antsy and the aura around him was getting extremely cold. Mitchell sighed, he should have known. Taking so many people with them, they'd be lucky if this guy didn't leave them behind midway. He looked at Ron and Spike, who were watching their interaction with interest, joined Garen and the others for the advanced party. Ron and Spike were really looking forward to seeing that magical territory again, so they were very happy at this order. Yes, Lord. As expected, the mission was indeed very popular, most especially because they found out that the ultra-strong Terran soldiers were going there, so they felt the trip would be especially safe. Juno, their own Aborigine guard, was also coming with them this time, to ensure minimal losses on the way back. However, because of the packing requirements, Beanie and Gordy volunteered to leave with a caravan at Bright and meet up with them in Althea later the next day. 5 soldiers would also be accompanying them for safety. While this was ongoing, Garen and the others were already ready to leave. They had long prepared to travel, buying more stocks from the stalls. They also took a quick bath as they didn't know when the next one would be. They haven't slept yet so that they would be able to finish their part of the deal within a day. The luxury rental house was basically unused. At the very least, they could use it to freshen up. Especially Garen, who was a bit of a neat freak. He also knew his wife was the same. He had not only cleaned up, but he had also shaved. He had also eaten ample amounts of papra, the peppermint alternative he brought a lot of. How could he wrong her by hugging her with all the grime, dust, and blood? Anyway, the team hadn't taken a shut-eye before heading out again. Fortunately, with their level, they could really go without a few days of sleep. The soldiers were a bit tired, but they couldn't ask the captain to wait for them, right? Not when he was missing his wife so much that he was borderline murderous. Fortunately, Eagle leaked what they talked about with the other lord. The territory they were heading towards was apparently even better than Bright, so they didn't have to feel so sad about leaving this wonderful place too soon. Actually, Aborigines' houses weren't that bad considering they seemed similar to the Terran Dark Ages. Ryo, the group nerd, couldn't help but say, I read that there were basically no toilets at the time. You could have chamber pots if you're rich. Others just threw their feces anywhere, even on the street. He paused, looking at them seriously. One theory is that this was the reason why heels were invented. It was so that the nobles who wear it don't directly step on all the shite. Gross. Why did you have to say that? Nobody asked for this information. Ryo shrugged. Garen just shook his head and ignored them, walking quickly to their destination. Their pace increased, though not to the point that it would quickly consume their energy. It was just at the right, but fast, pace so that they didn't need to take a lot of breaks. A few hours later, they reached the resting spot between the three territories, and they couldn't help but admire the territory that set it up. "This is so thoughtful," Lewis said as he opened up a rough stone box. It was as tall as his knee and covered with a stone slab. Opening the lid, he realized that it hid some non-perishable food inside. Mao, the one with the sharpest nose, immediately appeared over his shoulders. Instant noodles. Seriously, Eagle went to them and saw the dozen or so servings of instant noodles wrapped in thin wood. "I heard someone in Bright sells it too, but they didn't have stock anymore. Now look at this." Mao unapologetically took it out and raised it high above his head. "Cheers," he yelled, scooting away to prepare it for consumption. Eagle ignored him and looked at what else was in the box. Other than the noodles, there was also a complete set of condiments and even rice. They really didn't expect it. Anyway, they had a comfortable lunch and a short rest. After eating, they began packing up and cleaning up their trash according to the resting place's rules, literally written in stone. They also put the remaining condiment back into the box, with Mao taking out expensive parchment paper A3 paper in size and doodling a few words of thanks on the first line. He left the paper down as well as an ink and its accompanying writing quill. His companions stared at him, impressed. "You're being quite generous." Mao blushed a bit and cleared his throat. "Well, people share their food. I don't have much else they'd be interested in." The others nodded, adding a bit of their own small items in the chest as well. They were nothing too luxurious. There were some clothes, some basic medicine and the like, but it was all with the heart of helping others and giving back. If Rowan would see this, he'd be amazed. It seemed everyone was like this. They shut the box closed, not knowing the piece of parchment would be a tool for at least a dozen people to find their loved ones. It also saved even more lives by virtue of giving hope. The group soon finished cleaning up the resting place, making sure that it was as near as to how it was when they got there. However, they had not finished packing up when they heard running footsteps coming in their direction. There were no yells or screams though, and their pace indicated they were simply in a rush and not being chased. So, although the soldiers were guarded, it was not so tense. A group of about 50 people were running to their location, and they flinched when they saw it occupied. "We're just using a small part," one said from the get-go upon seeing their physiques. The soldiers didn't mind, of course, but they were a bit surprised at the naturalness people arrived here with, despite their apparent tension. It seemed that this place had been used a lot, and people had an unspoken agreement on how to handle it. It was just that someone from Bright frowned and walked towards the new group. "Aren't you from Vismont?" Ron asked. He was on the tour with him back in Althea. The tense man relaxed when he recognized Ron. He lightened up like seeing an old friend. "Ah, yes, we escaped. Barely." He paused. It was so scary. So many monster groups of levels 4 and 5 kept attacking the wall. If the Lord hadn't chosen to upgrade the wall again after everyone's help, we'd have fallen an hour in. "How is it now?" Ron asked. It wasn't that he really cared about another territory. He cared more about the fact that it could easily happen to Bright as well. "When we escaped through the other gate, the wall was still going strong." He said, "We also encountered monsters on the way, but thankfully we were rescued on time." Another skinny man nodded, eyes filled with admiration. "Thank goodness we encountered the people of Althea." Everyone in the mercenary team froze. Althea. The man obviously did not notice what was wrong. "Yes, our lord requested their help and they came. That fireball was so magical. Ms. Althea is as beautiful as always." "Althea." The skinny man squealed like a girl as his thin shoulders were held by a strange man's iron grip. "You mean she's there?" the man asked, low voice reverberating, and the thin man nodded wildly in terror. "Where?" The man shakily pointed at the path he was on. About a few hour run from here." "I'll go ahead," was all Garen said, eyes fixed in a direction. The next moment, he instantaneously disappeared everyone's from sight. When he arrived at Vismont about half an hour later, the battle was almost over, with the initial batch of level 5s long dealt with, and now a new more powerful batch was being killed. They were level 7s and 8s, and Matthew was thankful they only arrived when the Alterans were already there. otherwise his new level 3 wall, with extremely sparse sentries due to the lack of funds even after so much solicitation, would definitely have given way early on. At this time, there were only about a dozen monsters left being dealt with by more than 100 people. This was what Garen and the others saw when they arrived. It wasn't difficult to see where his wife was. She was standing gallantly over the battlement, proficiently using her bow and arrow. She was still so beautiful, like an angel, continuously firing arrows and accurately hitting monster after monster, saving a lot of people by the way. Although her level wasn't enough to kill them in one shot, it caused considerable damage. With her cooperation with the guards, they managed to deal with various level 7 and level 8 monsters. But more than anything, he observed her carefully and made sure she was truly healthy and safe. "Wife," he whispered breathlessly, his cerulean eyes fixed on her figure, following her every move. His eyes strung as he did so, his cold, empty heart filling up again. Althea heaved a sigh as she watched the final monster fall down with a flop. Finally over. She had brought 20 guards with her, including Rowan, to deal with the monsters. The levels were just perfect to train with. Rowan helped the Vismont guards deal with half of the monsters, and then she and her 20 guards worked together to deal with the remaining ones. This time she was in charge of the long-range support and backup, as she was not allowed by Rowan and the guards to do close combat. They wanted to train, they said. Then the stronger batch came and she brightened. She took out the 3 level 8s by herself despite consuming all the mana food she had in stock. She watched with a smile as the citizens cheered when they saw the last monster taken down. After confirming there were no more attacks, she finally relaxed her stance. Now that it was calm, Althea finally felt the heated stare that had been directed in her direction. Puzzled, she turned her head and froze. Her heart stopped as she saw the face that she had been dreaming of for months. His skin had become a bit darker and coarse, but he was still so handsome, charming, and reliable as he always was. "Husband," she whispered, her ears ringing from shock, but she soon remembered where she was, soon realizing that she was not dreaming. Her tear ducts broke instantaneously at the realization. "Husband," she yelled again, voice cracking, and she skillfully jumped down the wall and sprinted to him with open arms. Garen, who had been holding back tears, also succumbed and opened his arms to meet her. When they were only a meter apart, he quickly lifted her up so he could embrace her tightly. In response, she hung on him like a koala. Garen expertly angled his face to meet hers for a heated kiss, which Althea met with similar enthusiasm. Everyone blushed and either looked away or covered their faces, understanding that these two had completely forgotten where they were. Only Ansel would ever have the guts to tell them off. He glared at the two most inconsiderate people ever. "Get a room, damn it. Holidays, so busy. I was only upload 1 chap for today, I'm sorry. If things weren't so haggard, I would have pushed for 1 more, especially since I got a super gift. Speaking of super gift, I would like to mention Lotus Lynn for giving my first castle Tilda thanks for letting it get exposed to more readers. Got 500 collections from that castle. Hugs asterisk. She is also a writer, guys. If you want to read fantasy stories based on Changi, her bunny and their men, check out her book. Aberdeen City, 2 years ago. On top of a rolling set of hills, hundreds of kilometers away from the bustle of the city, stood a quaint church, dipped in a warm glow by the setting sun. In contrast to its usual lulled atmosphere, however, the church was now bustling with activity, as guests of all types arrived one by one to what would be one of the most important events in a young couple's life. It was no surprise that the bride was looking very worried as she stared at herself in the mirror. She was currently inside the softly lit bridal suite deep inside the church, alone with her mother and her own swirling thoughts. "He'll be fine," Alicia, dressed in a beautiful chiffon gown, said next to her. The woman smiled, embracing her. "He always is." A mother's touch always had something magical, and a lot of her tension dissipated. When she softened, Alicia let go a bit so she could stare at her daughter's glimmering emerald eyes. "He wouldn't miss this for the world," she said, gently patting the girl's cheek. Alicia couldn't help but admire the beautiful young woman with teary eyes. Her Althea was really so beautiful, like an angel, especially now in preparation to the special occasion that marked the next phase of her life. Althea's features had always been very delicate, but now they were further emphasized by the color of her makeup, framed beautifully by her shining auburn hair arranged in a complex arrangement of curls and braids. The young woman's wedding gown naturally wasn't inferior either. It was a gorgeous masterpiece of silk, satin, and lace. It had an off-shoulder design with its bodice hugging her figure perfectly, extending downwards to create a long trail of silk adorned with intricate floral patterns. It was absolutely the most beautiful gown Alicia had ever seen, fitting her daughter, who also happened to be the most beautiful bride ever. This was a bespoke wedding dress, commissioned from the world-famous fashion designer Andre by Winona. Mother, Althea sniffed, pretty eyebrows still crunched in worry, and Alicia couldn't help but smile at her. "You know how strong he is more than anyone." But Althea mumbled but said nothing else. She forced herself from saying anything unlucky. She just pursed her red lips and tried not to think anymore. Althea sighed at the timing of everything. Garen had actually asked for a long leave in preparation for and after their wedding. Sadly, a couple of days ago, he was called on a mission against an infamous terrorist group. She knew it was dangerous. His safety weighed heavily in her heart, and she worried for him so. But Mother was right. Garen was so strong and he always came out safe. Alicia saw her daughter's mood calm and smiled, adjusting the veil and handing her the gorgeous bouquet of flowers on the side table. It was a pretty arrangement of fresh lilies, roses, and her favorite wild daisies. And Althea held on to it tightly, as if it would help her stabilize her mood. And now all they had to do was wait. The clock ticked slowly and tortuously, but Althea just hoped her fiancé was okay. Fortunately, Winona, who had planned the wedding grudgingly with Ansel, ran to her room a few minutes later. Her eyes were bright, and Althea's heart lifted, knowing it was the good news she had been waiting for. "He's here." Hearing this, Althea gave the most genuine smile she wore in days. "This is really happening," Howard said, sniffing, looking at his daughter warmly and with pride, also a bit teary, which made Alicia laugh out loud. "Come on now, it's time." Howard made a face. Garen would have her all to himself. Surely he can wait a few minutes. The two women laughed, and the remaining tension Althea was feeling was blown away. A few minutes later, they finally stepped in front of the entrance. With two men opening the large doors, they entered the massive hall. They had been here before, of course, but somehow it felt bigger now, more sacred. The church had a high vaulted ceiling, intricately carved with complex patterns and shapes. The sight was enhanced by the lights from the orange sun outside, and the reddish rays lit up the aisle as if leading her to her future husband. Satin ribbons of their wedding colors adorned each pew. Each row had similar flower arrangements to what the bride had on her hands, and it rounded everything visually. Their footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, and the entire church seemed to hold its breath at her appearance. The walk felt long but also short. She passed pew after pew with a complex combination of nerves and excitement, and she could hear her own heartbeat beating against her chest. The regal altar in front soon appeared closer, its arch shape framing her husband-to-be, and the golden light from the resting sun lit up his figure, as if emphasizing that he was heaven-sent to her. Her eyes never left him, and she stamped his image into her heart. He was wearing the most formal military uniform for the occasion. It was cut to fit his good shape, successfully showing off his figure of regality. It also had a midnight blue coat adorned with shimmering epaulettes. His chest wore a row of medals and insignia, a testament to his achievements and bravery, and she couldn't help but be proud of him at the sight of it. His raven black hair was neatly combed, but his strong jawline was tense as he stood. She knew he was just as nervous as she was. Althea soon got close enough so they were only an arm's length away, and when their eyes met, she couldn't stop her eyes from watering. Similarly, Garen's eyes, which were filled with longing, met hers, and she could see his breath becoming irregular as he looked at her. Time stopped at that moment. This was it, they thought with pounding hearts. They were going to embark on a new chapter of their lives. Garen extended his hand to her as their father let her go. She smiled, taking his hand. "I'm glad you're safe, my love." But she paused a bit at a realization that his hand was cold and a bit sweaty, abnormally so. She blinked and raised her head, looking at him in concern. However, nothing showed in Garen's face as he simply stared at her warmly, only having her in his eyes. He raised their entwined palms and placed the back of her soft hands against his lips. "I wouldn't miss this even if the world ended." a few kilometers from Althea village, present. The couple was so sticky that it hurt everyone's eyes. Garin even said his wife was tired and insisted on carrying her bridal style the whole way. The shamelessness was beyond them. What was even more amazing was that because of their sprint, the travel that should have taken at least an hour was reduced to a fraction. As for how Garin moved across the forest so smoothly at this speed, not falling even with him staring at the woman in his arms 80% of the time, they didn't even know. Throughout this time, the couple was just staring at each other while steadily traversing the forest, with the captain occasionally leaning down to give her a peck on the face, on the cheek, or on the lips. Althea's face was flushed as she stared at her handsome lover. It seemed the blood crept all the way to her brain, that she had lost all thought and just wanted to look at her husband. She seemed to have forgotten something. But then Garin leaned down again as he jumped over an overgrown root, giving her a soft peck on the lips. Ah, never mind. Anyway, the others were so blinded and tired by the cheesy sight that they weren't able to appreciate Althea until they entered the bustling streets inside. Their feet stopped as they absorbed the sight in a bit of disbelief, then saw what was being sold and what the so-called guides were selling them. The soldiers were quickly attracted by, well, everything and were completely separated from the lover-dovey couple. After tasting the food, they were very happy. Sanity restored. Not far from the entrance, Ansel looked at the blonde man who was staring blankly at the direction the sticky couple had just disappeared to. It was Oslo who had gone out of his cultivation session to welcome her back. Instead, he was greeted by the sight of said woman being sweet and loving with another man. Ansel saw everything. Seeing the poor guy so pale that he seemed to have lost all blood, Ansel couldn't help but sigh. The redhead walked over and patted the guy's shoulder. Taking out a big jar of alcohol he got from Althea. "Drink." Oslo stared at him blankly before nodding. "Okay," he said, following Ansel's lead, his eyes darkening a bit as he looked at the pathway under his feet. "Thank you." Althea, who had her arms wrapped around her husband's neck, gave instructions on where to go. They entered the villa's gate, and she added her husband to the access list. "Our room is on the right side of the house after entering the door," she said, feeling her husband's heat and knowing what he needed immediately. She too was eager to feel his warmth, his entirety. He said with a hoarse voice, the pace of his power walk doubling. They were so engrossed with each other that they breezed through the living room, not noticing Harold and the two children in the room at all. Harold and the kids had been playing on the carpet floor, and they froze at the realization that someone had just zoomed by. "Harold, little meatball, little pepper." Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story.